Shiva, Arunachala, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala. The nature of the supreme consciousness will manifest only upon the destruction of the individual consciousness, which is the reflection of that supreme consciousness in the faculties of mind, sense, and action. This is the final verse in Muruganar's Sadhaka Kuriya Sattanu Nerigal, the disciplines that are essential in the spiritual aspirant. This is a little booklet written by Muruganar, which has only been available in Tamil up until now. Muruganar, as you all probably know, was one of the foremost devotees of Bhagavan and has written extensively about Bhagavan and in praise of Bhagavan. We've been very fortunate that through the request of one devotee, Dorab, for a translation, a whole chain of events resulted in us now having an annotated booklet meticulously translated by Robert Butler with help from Michael James and Sankaran. Some of you would have come across this publication, this part of this, in the last issue of the Mountain Path, the October-December Mountain Path. The manuscript has been placed in front of Bhagavan's shrine today on his Jayanthi, and this booklet will shortly be available as an ashram publication. Muruganar, in his very short introduction, warns that we will not all be pleased with the contents of this work. And similarly, I crave your indulgence, as you may not all be pleased with the bits that I have chosen. I have deliberately not chosen Bhagavan's teachings because many have been included, but I have concentrated on those excerpts which have made me reflect on my thoughts, my deeds, my actions, which do and will continue to get in the way of my sadhana. This gem of a book contains 96 terse verses, which are, I think, an essential guidebook for the spiritual aspirant. We frequently ask, but how to follow this path and how to go back the way we came? And the response is, does anyone need to be shown the way into their own house? And yet we struggle. In this very concise set of aphorisms, Muruganar has taken pity on us and tells us how to clear the debris so that we have a clear path such that nothing gets in the way of that journey home. He has included some quotations from various other Tamil devotional and ethical texts like Avayar, Manikavasagar, and the Tirukkural. And as I said, the booklet is interspersed with Bhagavan's teachings. The book is full of self-evident truths, which we don't usually stop and think about. But when we see it in this form, we think, but of course, every one of you will find your own favorites amongst the 96 verses. Each time I read it, I'm struck by something new. So I'm going to share a few of my favorites and leave you to discover yours. I'll start with verse 30. The first lesson that true sadhakas must learn is to conduct themselves with a firm resolve to maintain their purity of heart. And in verse 26, he reminds us of some of the elements of the purity of heart. Those who live in expectation of the Lord's grace must needs harbor love for the beloved creatures who share his form. And in verse 23, he laments thus, that those who refuse to joyfully bestow their affection upon the beings they see and meet at first hand will melt and dissolve in love for a God who cannot be seen, is indeed the wonder of wonders. And in the next verse, he says, that's verse 24, to whatever extent they drive from their hearts thoughts of I and mine, to that extent shall they turn towards the Lord and draw near to him. Then there are numerous verses on self-control and self-restraint. In verse 33, he says, excess should be altogether avoided by the wise. Even ambrosia taken to excess is a poison. And in verse 37, he says, do not speak harshly or ignore or reject anyone. An unruly bullock will come to bear a greater burden, and he will not escape punishment. And in verse 60, before the mind can be purified, one's speech must be purified. And verse 69, avoid disputation. Empty disputation is like dry bones. Knowledge born of experience is worth 1,000 gold pieces. That's verse 4. And in verse 38, it says, self-restraint is much more important than knowledge. How we act is more important than what we think. And then there are many verses on humility. In verse 31, he says, whatever abilities they may possess, sadhakas should not flaunt themselves in the least degree. If they do so, it will remain to the very end a great obstacle to their sadhana, their most important endeavor to attain the refuge of the soul. And one of my favorites is verse 77. Do not wag your tail, act pompously, or put on airs, forgetting our master, the all-pervading, all-powerful Lord. So, in other words, just don't get above yourself. Just remember who is really in control. And in verse 41, he says, should anyone scorn you and spread slander about you, your attitude should be one of gratitude towards them for giving you the opportunity of recognizing and correcting some fault that you might otherwise not easily have noticed yourself. The wise will be aware that if conversely you cling stubbornly to that fault and hate and disparage that person, these are sure presages of the ruin that is destined soon to overtake you. And Muruganar also reminds us that our needs are so little, and yet we are constantly grasping for things. In verse 36, a measure of rice and 4 cubits of cloth to wear is all we need. Is it for just this that we endure such suffering in the world? And finally, what is the point of gathering all this and not putting it to use? Verse 94, alas for the fate of those people who have the time only to gather dry leaves, but no time to light the fire and fend off the cold. As I said at the beginning, I've chosen a few verses, and I hope this gives you a flavor of this work. This booklet speaks to me. Each time I read it, as I've said, I find fresh insights, and it gives me pause to reflect on my words, my deeds, and my actions, and how they may get in the way of my journey. I do hope you will find it useful on your journey too. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya.